That was cool. That's the beginning. Now we're about to get into the Battle of Kursk, which is what we were actually originally going to do today. It was... People didn't seem super excited about it. It was at the bottom of the poll that I did, but let's be fair, it had some stiff competition. It had some pretty stiff competition. I really enjoyed the last several extra history things that we've done on the channel, so I'm just going to assume this was the lowest on a list of just series that would give you very high standards. There we go. So the Battle of Kursk, I don't really have any foundational knowledge of this one, so we're just gonna go for it. I don't have a whole lot of foundational knowledge on World War II in general.
Thanks to the folks over at Wargaming, over the next few weeks, we're going to be bringing you an additional set of extra history episodes to talk about the Battle of Kursk.
So I don't know if these are organized in the playlist, like, in just the order that they felt was the best, or if it's in, like, the order in which they released them, or if there's some chronology to take in mind here. Of course, if you're talking about the resource war, you're not really talking about the war, like, in an entirely... the narrative isn't just driven by linearity, it's driven by a very specific approach to war. You're not just taking the war in order there, you're analyzing a very specific way of conducting war more than anything. I don't know as much about, like, how the rest of the stuff's gonna fit into the playlist. So the order is preset, it is what it is. We'll figure it out.
The largest tank battle in world history. But first we need to set the scene. It's June 1941. For weeks, Nazi Germany's forces have been building along the eastern frontier. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia have been working together since...
My family were in London during the Blitz. My great-great-grandfather was killed in December 1940 during the bombing raid. That's what I'm saying. There's, like... There's such a... I guess an even international understanding and unity around the world wars in Europe that it's harder to appreciate, I think, from the United States. I could only understand it abstractly because I don't have, like, my country doesn't have the same shared national trauma that Europe had. Even if you were on opposite sides during the war, it's still possible that you share a sort of a common experience with people, well, cultures that came to blows during this time. So, like, I appreciate hearing, I appreciate you sharing that story, because I think it's incredibly interesting seeing how people even today were kind of, like, touched by that. And kind of how it butterflies into where we are now.
Since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, but that's all about to change. The ideologies, policies, and war goals of these two nations have always been opposed. Tensions have been mounting since the exclusion of the Soviet Union from the Axis alliance between Japan, Italy, and the German Reich. Conflict...
You don't think there is, like, a shared, like, understanding between European countries? Like, it seems like if there isn't, there should be. I don't know. It seems like a lot of my understanding of that is very anecdotal. Dude, what are you doing? A lot of my understanding of that is very anecdotal, but, like, a lot of these places have experienced this very shared conflict. Wait. There was lots of shared trauma in the U.S. and attempts to oh, you mean the U.S. Shared trauma in the U.S. and attempts of reconciliation between Americans and Japanese. Okay, there we go. I guess I do think, like, I'm not saying that Americans can't relate, but, like, on a broader level, it's not as easy because we did experience the war differently. Like, Americans were there. They absolutely were. But I just don't know if the national memory has held on to it in the same way. with it not having been at home, I guess. This is all like, I could potentially be wrong here. Maybe it's just where I am. We also live in a world that's where we're so far removed from that. The United States has had plenty of conflicts. Like, I think the post 9/11 world has taken on stuff like this far differently. Like, if 9/11 had never happened, I feel like 9/11 in a lot of ways kind of replaced the tragedy of Pearl Harbor as sort of like the go-to unifying loss, which I think in a lot of ways sort of alienates us from the still existing attachment to the losses that occurred in Europe, because I think a lot of European countries are still far more attached to that than the current generation of people in the United States are. Of course, there's still an older generation that would still appreciate that on a larger level, but I think we are in a firmly different time. We think about our international politics differently from that. I think Americans seem incredibly also out of touch when I look at the current conflict. I think Europeans seem like they understand a little bit more how this could go, and it feels like a lot of Americans don't seem to understand how poorly this could go. and that's I think that comes from perhaps ignorance. There's sort of like this idea of like invincibility that the United States has had. Like, we've been attacked, but very rarely war is something that happens over there. Wherever over there is, it happens over there. I don't know.
Fights over the Balkans have been escalated.
Thoughts.
Peace cannot last.
You know,
On the
whatever.
21st of June, it's time.
Was thinking about it.
Race eastward, tearing through the Russian lines. Surprise is total. Moscow's in a state of shock at the invasion. The Soviet troops fight bravely, but their leadership has been gutted by the vicious Stalinist purges. The Wehrmacht juggernaut cannot be stopped. Thousands of Soviet planes are destroyed by the Luftwaffe while still on the ground. Within hours, the Germans have decimated any semblance of command. Suicidal orders from Moscow demand a counterattack. Soviet troops either attempt counterassaults or withdraw piecemeal. Over the next few weeks, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers are captured and sent back to serve as slave labor in the German camps. And in the Balkans, the German troops are hailed as liberators by people.
The service, I did read a book about this recently. I think it's called Ivan's War, where the Soviets come in and they eventually liberate those camps, and what they viewed when they saw the treatment of Russians and later saw the treatment of Jews in the concentration camps, that it actually helped the Soviet leadership kind of get people to like double down in the direction of nationalism, kind of in opposition to the horrors of Germany and everything that they did during this time. Like, seeing all of that horror, seeing that treatment actually made people who were perhaps a little bit more on the fence about this emerging government that's still very young at this point. It probably pushed a lot of people more to towards more extreme thoughts. That's all.
People looking west for salvation from the brutal Soviet regime. But not all is quite as rosy as it seemed for the Nazi Reich. Despite the incredible losses suffered by the Soviet army, an unacceptably large number of Soviet...
I will give you... Sorry, I keep pausing. I'll go back. I will give you this. Americans are not great students of history. I remember... Do I even need that? No, I don't even need to talk about it. Every time this comes up, I always end up like talking about like the panic around critical race theory. Recently, we had like the copycat trucker protests in the United States, kind of emulating the protests that occurred in Canada. And I believe they put out like their goals, and one of the things that they were protesting apparently was the teaching of critical race theory in schools. I don't know what the hell that has to do with trucking or whatever, but it kind of does show that people have no idea what they're mad at, because people aren't being taught that in schools. The 1619 project came out, and that like broke everybody's brain, even though that's totally uncontroversial when you look at people in academic circles. Like, oh, people are highlighting traditionally marginalized groups in history, and trying to highlight how the different identity creates different experiences. How dare they? They want us to hate America. No, that's where scholarship has been. So Americans freak out over the dumbest things sometimes. I will give you that. But I don't think Americans are uniquely alone. I think a lot of people assume that Americans are the only ones who are that ignorant of history. I think it may be a little bit more widespread than a lot of places may be willing to admit. Though I would say, my country, we really got to step our game up. We've got to be willing to confront our own history, honestly.
Soviet regime. But not all is quite as rosy as it seemed.
Like Catherine Meredale. Was it Catherine Meredale who did that book? I do want to check that. I have the book digitally right here. The Ivan's War book I was talking about before. Yeah, Catherine Meredale. It was a really good book. I gotta go back to it because I had to read it all in like a few days, so I didn't remember the whole thing. This is why you shouldn't procrastinate.
For the Nazi Reich. Despite the incredible losses suffered by the Soviet army, an unacceptably large number of Soviet troops had been able to slip through the gaps between the racing panzers and the infantry mired in crossing the muddy and insufficient roads of the rural European East. And despite the destruction of so many Soviet aircraft, the front the Germans were fighting on was simply too expansive to control, and they'd lost too many pilots and planes in the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe simply could not maintain total air superiority in the East. And whatever goodwill the people of the
So this is chronological.
The invading troops was lost almost instantly due to the ever-mounting number of Nazi atrocities, crimes against what they considered to be an inhuman race. For the rest of the war, there would be almost constant resistance striking the Germans behind the front lines as the army tried to push even further east. As the push east continued and the summer rains set in, the advance slowed. Meanwhile, the Soviets began to reorganize. The holes in the leadership left by Stalin's purges were filled. Competence began to trump ideology when appointing officers. The communication structure was improved, and some semblance of a coordinated battle plan was drawn. The first coordinated resistance came at Smolensk. Thousands of Soviet tanks rushed west in a desperate attempt to halt the German advance. 500,000 men on each side clashed in one of the largest operations to date. It was a disaster for the Russians. Hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers were cut off and shipped back to Germany as slave labor. Thousands of tanks were left burning husks in the Russian fields. But as much as this might have appeared to be a total German victory, the Soviet attack had slowed the German advance, costing them time and material that they could not afford.
Main reason we in the US are worse at history is because our history starts in either 1492 or the 1700s. For most other countries, that is an incredibly short-sighted view of history. Yeah, one would think that it's okay to study one's country's own history or you don't necessarily need to study every element of world history because there's too much history, so people will learn from their own lens or whatever. However, I don't even think it's necessarily the periodization of American history. I think we've suddenly become incredibly the current problem is that we're afraid of going away from like the norm We've had these like idealized political histories written for generations. The scholarship has been moving towards intersectionality and highlighting how different parts of human identity drive different actions and stuff like that. And that could range from things like gender. It can range from things like it could be military, it could be economic. We could talk about class or social, cultural elements and all of that. But a lot of it, a lot of what people really consume in history, it isn't exactly in line with what they're putting out in academic press right now. I guess our popular history is different from our academic history. I think the academic history can be pretty good. And I'm not saying that all of the popular history is bad. There can be some very well written popular history books. However, sometimes they fail to serve any broader purpose than be like a pretty cool biography. Scholarship's weird right now. Academic presses are dying. People need to learn how to write for a general audience and still tell good history. And it's hard. It's a hard task.
And splitting their command. Many of the German generals wanted to race for Moscow, to keep their forces concentrated and focus on the one objective that might end the war. Hitler instead ordered the army to disperse and capture industrial and agricultural centers around the USSR. By September, Nazi German forces were surrounding Leningrad in what would become one of the most desperate and probably most deadly sieges in all of history. What the Germans hoped to be a quick victory would drag out in a brutal battle of attrition for years. By October, bad weather began to set in, and the Luftwaffe's ability to control the sky became severely stretched. By December, the Soviet Air Force had even achieved superiority in some sections of the front. Though offenses had stalled on other fronts, having at last culled the Soviet army to the point where the Wehrmacht nearly matched it in sheer manpower, Hitler ordered one final desperate push on Moscow in the fall before the Russian winter truly set in. At this point, though, supply lines were a problem. Fuel, munitions, and warm clothing couldn't be transported over the vast distance between the German industrial heartland and the Moscow frontier in time. German divisions were undermanned, and replacements, when they could be found, struggled to make it across the bombed-out roads from Europe to the front. Still, the initial month of the offensive seemed a success. German troops pushed through the defensive rings around Moscow. By the beginning of November, forces of the Third Reich were at the very gates. But the troops were exhausted. There were no reserves. They'd been fighting continually in the ever-worsening Russian weather for months. The troops needed to rest, but every day the Soviets drew in reserves from its vast territory to the east, regaining strength. By mid-November, the ground froze, and the final push into Moscow began. But the temperature dropped. In early December, it was sometimes as cold as minus 48 degrees Celsius. The fighting was brutal, and the winter itself claimed many lives. It was too much. The drive on Moscow stopped. Operation Barbarossa had failed. Then the Soviet counterattack began. Week after week, they rolled back the German line. The Soviet forces were better prepared for this harsh winter, and began to regain their footing against the freezing and exhausted forces of the once unshakable German army. But even as the German offensive stalled in the north, a new objective was decided upon in the south: Stalingrad. By summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht began driving toward its new goal, and towards oil fields in the south of Soviet territory. By the fall of 1942, it was clear that the oil fields wouldn't be captured by the onset of winter, so all eyes turned to Stalingrad. The leaders of both nations decided this was the line. No land beyond the Volga, declared Stalin, and Hitler demanded that this city named after their foe must fall. Within days of the offensive's beginning, the Luftwaffe had reduced the city to rubble. But rather than surrender, the Soviets just dug into the ruins of the city. Fighting was brutal house-to-house combat. Grand strategy broke down into 1,000 small actions of a handful of men fighting for the bombed-out remains of a factory or an apartment building. But both sides just kept sending men into the meat grinder that was Stalingrad. By November, the Germans had pushed up to the very banks of the Volga. But even as German troops were approaching the Volga, the Soviets had another plan taking shape. The Germans had been so focused on the city that their defensive line along the front around the city had weakened. This German army had been so used to being on the offensive that it had let its defenses slip, and the Soviets planned to make them pay for that mistake. Soviet forces smashed through the Soviets planned
Operation Uranus? Really?
And to make
Why would they
them pay for that mistake?
I'm sure there's a good reason.
Smashed through the thinly defended lines around the city, crushing the Romanian forces that were supposed to serve as the flank for the German 6th Army in Stalingrad. Rapidly, the Soviets closed the circle. The 6th Army was now pinned, with their forces from Stalingrad on one side and the Soviet counteroffensive push on the other. Initially, a breakout was suggested, but members of the Luftwaffe convinced Hitler that they could provide supplies by air to help the pinned army fight on. But it was nowhere near enough. The trapped forces began to starve. Every day, more of the planes so desperately needed for resupply were shot down.
I find it interesting that you guys have historically... maybe I shouldn't talk around myself using words like that. That you guys have had experiences of like not studying any American history after 1945. I find that really interesting because in my experience, I've gone into a little bit more through like the Vietnam era, and we studied the civil rights movement a whole bunch. But the thing with American education, it's far more localized, and you could get a very different experience in one state from another, or one county to another, however deep it could break down. There might be subtle differences in between them, but like I find that incredibly interesting. But I think this is sort of like one of the big things I'd like to emphasize. Americans are not just one thing. It's a sweeping country. New England may not be the same as Texas, which is not the same as California, which is not the same as North Dakota. So people have had different experiences. So maybe I shouldn't generalize Americans based on my experience, and other people shouldn't generalize America based on like the worst things they've heard, I suppose. And when I make observations about the American education system, it's often through my own lens, and I kind of recognize that.
A push to relieve the forces was made, but stalled out.
Oh, answer to my question about the Uranus thing. Because Russians were naming their big offenses for planets, and Uranus doesn't have any implications in Russian that does in English. I don't know when the how long the Uranus thing was like a joke, like Uranus. I don't know. Mental. When I was in high school here in the UK, we learned history up to the Gulf War. I attended high school up until 2012. Huh. Interesting. Yeah, and you should. You should, almost certainly. I think I learned a lot about Vietnam because of like how culturally significant Vietnam was. I don't think they were opposed to teaching us about the Gulf War. I just think it kind of lost in the battle of priorities. I think I got decent amount of depth, paid attention to a lot of the things that I learned about. There were some classes that were less good than others. I mean, the experience varied, but I think there's like a handful of conflicts that certainly lost based on them not being considered as historically significant in the broader American consciousness. And I think a lot of the time almost all of the time that's incorrect. And I get that you sometimes you'll sometimes miss some stuff. Sometimes you'll go through your education and you don't learn about this or that. That's a thing. I don't think in my experience there was anything particularly... I think my education was decent enough. I should have paid better attention though from more early on. I wasn't a very good student early on. So this isn't me. This is me like kind of taking the taking the blame for a lot of the failures during my own education. I think I was a bad student up until I got my got like most of the way through my bachelor's degree. I was so bad. I didn't try. Then I started trying, and I'm slowly trying to make up for all the things that I missed in so much of my life.
As the trapped forces were too exhausted to make a breakout, and their commander was
in German education system, sorry, we're stopping a lot, but this conversation's interesting to me. In the German education system, World War II is sort of glossed over. That's interesting because I've heard that, but I've also heard sort of the opposite, which is interesting to me. I've heard that there was, in some people's experience, a lot of emphasis was put on it sort of as a way of correcting and like emphasizing how bad that all was. I don't know. That's very interesting to me, because I've heard so many mixed things when it comes to Germany's education system. Primarily being discrimination against the Jews, but you don't go into the actual war, like battles and stuff. Yeah, I think. Oh wait, what? I mean, what do ordinary people need more, like the cultural side or the military side? I think a lot of the time education systems put too much emphasis on the battle side of war. I think that's a product of an old way of doing history. So I think, honestly, Germany might have their priorities right there. Like the battles and stuff, they kind of matter, but like only so much. There are more important angles that one could take. So to, I guess, defend the German education system, like military history is overrated. It is what it is. I think it really is. It has a disproportionately high degree of influence on education, not just in the United States, but in a lot of places. You learn about the lead up and the aftermath and ideology and such. Okay. Yeah, that's what I would prioritize above all. I'm not saying that you should like downplay the events of the war. You should absolutely teach the events of the war, but the other stuff I think might be more important. I don't know. In my 600-page German history book, World War II gets 40 pages. In my old one, it only got like 10. Jeez. Okay, maybe that's not enough. That isn't enough. Like philosophically, I agree with like focusing on the cultural side of that stuff, because I think that's more relevant to your ordinary person. I think some people will focus a lot on the military stuff, but I think the cultural and social stuff is probably some of the better material for ordinary Joe Schmo McGee German person to learn about. I think they'd find more significance from that in their everyday life and their understanding of their nation's history. I think culture is often an underrated driving force. I don't mean to trash talk military history too much. It's not that. I just think I say it's disproportionately popular. Like it has just completely drowned out a lot of other perspectives when a lot of people approach history. It's not usually like that on the college level. They kind of get away from that, but I feel like for so many people learn history and pick like their area of study around like, I want this period from World War II to this period in this war, and they'll like frame it using wars as sort of like the bookends, like those are the moments there, though that's not the only way of breaking down history. I think the schools don't give enough context into the wars and should be prioritized over specific battles. Yeah, absolutely. The battles matter. The battles absolutely matter. I don't know too much about it specifically, so I guess that's the extent of my commentary on that. I'm gonna shift back to what we were doing. I'm gonna go back like 10 seconds.
The trapped forces began to starve, Every day, more of the planes so desperately needed for resupply were shot down. A push to relieve the forces was made, but stalled out, as the trapped forces were too exhausted to make a breakout, and their commander was unwilling to defy Hitler's order to hold firm. At last, the Soviets offered surrender terms to the Sixth Army, but the offer was rejected because of Hitler's order. The trapped, hopeless troops fought on. Finally, by the first days of February, resistance collapsed. But even when personally captured, the commander of the Sixth Army Group refused to surrender. As 1942 turned into 1943, with setbacks in North Africa and the imminent possibility of an Allied front in Italy, there was one last possibility for the Germans to regain the offensive and prevent a collapse in the East. Join us next time for the real beginning of the Battle of Kursk.
Hey, let's see where this takes us, I guess. I'm surprised we're still on episode 1. I have to actually get through a little bit more. We got a big conversation about education.
Today, I'd like to kick
and it's
this off
interesting.
by doing something.
I love hearing about what everybody else learns about things that I've learned about. Because, like, you will get different experiences depending on where you are, whether it's in different parts of the United States or in different countries.
Thing we rarely get to do. You see, wargaming employs a fellow named Richard Cutland, aka the Challenger. He's an ex-British tankie who served 30 years, both in peace and during war, and now he's a military specialist for wargaming. And we figured, why not invite him on to talk about how tanks evolved from the beginning of Barbarossa to the Battle of Kursk, to discuss the types of tanks and the mechanized weaponry present there,
Sounds
to give us a
interesting.
picture of how the German and Soviet tanks fared against one another, and to discuss the effects of winter and weather on armored combat of the day. So, Richard Cutland, why don't you set the scene for us?
My pleasure. At the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans weren't expecting much from their opponents' tank forces, which were mostly composed of old T-26 and BTs. But little did they know the most advanced Soviet tank models, the brand new KV-1 and T-34, were actually superior to all German tanks. The German standard anti-tank weapons were found to be ineffective against these new Soviet vehicles. Still, these tanks were not available in great numbers. Their deployment was still incomplete when Barbarossa commenced. By 1941, the Red Army had deployed 1,000 T-34s and over 500 KV tanks, concentrated in only 5 of their 29 mechanized corps. Plus, the Soviet numerical advantage in heavy equipment was thoroughly offset by the superior training and organization of the Wehrmacht. Soviet tank units were rarely well equipped. They lacked training and logistical support. Units were sent into combat with no arrangements in place for refueling, ammunition, resupply, or personal replacement.
That
Often, after a
sounds
single engagement, units were destroyed
unwise.
or rendered ineffective. But on the German side, their few encounters with the powerful Soviet KV-1s and T-34s raised clear warning signs. They sent a special Panzer Commission to the Eastern Front on 20th of November 1941 to study and learn from the superior Russian T-34s. The Germans now realised the advantage of sloped armour, which either deflected or reduced the impact of armoured-piercing shells. They introduced longer guns for the Panzer IV and added side skirts to protect the vehicles from anti-tank rifles. By the summer of 1943, right in time for the Battle of Kursk, the Wehrmacht was being equipped with the fruits of this research. The Tiger and Panther tanks were introduced, as was the new Ferdinand tank destroyer. Hitler focused heavily on these new designs, which he believed were the key to victory, and matched them with an increase in manpower. By the summer of 1943, 2/3 of the German army were based in Russia. That belief paid early dividends. When the Panther tank first appeared on the battlefields of the Eastern Front, the Soviets did not have an effective weapon to counter it. During the Battle of Kursk, it demonstrated that it could destroy any Soviet armoured fighting vehicle from long distance. As a result, it had a very high overall kill ratio, despite making up less than 7% of the estimated 2,400 to 2,700 total armoured fighting vehicles deployed by the Germans in this battle. But at the same time, it had been rushed to the field unready. Many units failed due to mechanical problems, and the Panther alone could not punch through the Soviets' layered defence system at Kursk. Even heavier tank designs like the Tiger were not a total win for Nazi Germany. While superior engineering-wise, they weren't easy to manufacture, which made them not suitable for wartime economics. You see, heavy tanks aren't that hard to make. You just add more of everything. But they're expensive, and they're hard to maintain, and they bog down, so they're only useful in certain situations. Indeed, the Soviets also had tanks comparable to the Tiger, the IS-2, plenty used, and they were also similar, big, deadly, and not really worth it. On the Soviet side, their research had focused on a new medium tank, called the T-43, but it had been commissioned back in 1942 to counter the Panzer IV, and it did not have enough firepower or armour protection to go up against Germany's new Panther. Many within the
Okay.
Soviet High Command believe the war.
So they were that's kind of an example of preparing for the conflict of the past rather than preparing for the conflict of the future. And that's a common thing. Like you directly try to fix something based on like what has happened rather than seeing where things could be, which I don't know how if they could have seen where things were going or not, but that's unfortunate for them.
Effort would be better served by simply making more of the same T-34s that they had introduced at the start of the war. T-34s had the advantage of being faster and more nimble than the larger German tanks. The Soviets used them to their advantage by massing tanks and running them at full speed against German positions. The Germans could destroy a Soviet tank before the Soviet tank could get into range, about 2 kilometers versus 1 kilometer. So in the end, the tanks of both countries wound up being pretty comparable. No one nation had clearly superior tank technology. What the Soviet Union did have, however, was a clearly superior industrial force. They outproduced the Germans. So the biggest difference by far between Soviet and German tanks is that more of the former existed. Their home terrain also gave the Soviets an advantage. The Kursk region was famous for its black earth, which produced considerable dust when dry. These huge dust clouds would cut off the powerful German air support from the battlefield, and since the Soviet defenders were stationary, they were able to set up better observation points to scout and target their enemies. Even when it rained, huge thunderstorms turned the ground into a muddy quagmire that halted the German offensive where speed was essential. The home ground advantage combined with preparation time had clearly played in the favour of the defenders. Now I'll kick it back to Dan, but first I want to say a huge thank you to the Extra History team. It's been an absolute privilege to work with you and to be part of this animated journey through history. To all the viewers, I wish you well and hope you find this series both entertaining and informative. And a final comment
Thank you, my
from the
friend.
Royal Tank Regiment's motto, fear naught.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Nice.
Okay, now that we're
I didn't think I'd care about tanks that much, as it not being typically in my typically my scope of interest, but it's kind of nice knowing the distinctions there. It's sort of something I take for granted because like I don't study military history, so that's interesting
a
enough.
little more familiar with the hardware involved, let's round this episode
Hopefully that
out
gives
with
me
little
a
more of
nice
the run-up
grounding
to
for the
what would
future
so
stuff.
famously be known as the Battle of Kursk. Last we left off, German forces had been pushed back from Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht 6th Army had been surrounded and destroyed, and the Soviets had taken the offensive. But reeling from this defeat, Hitler finally gave full operational control to his general in charge of Army Group South, Erich von Manstein. Manstein decided to trade territory for time and accept retreat on a scale Hitler never would have the year before. His plan was to lure the Soviets forward until there was a time and place where he could pounce on an overextended Soviet line. He found that opportunity at Kharkov. As the Soviets pushed forward past the city, Manstein's reorganized and reinforced panzer divisions fell on their flanks. They rapidly encircled and cut off pockets of the Red Army. Soon the city of Kharkov was back in their hands. The Soviet losses were nothing like they were at the outset of the war, but losing 85,000 soldiers in a matter of weeks at the cost
Nothing
of
to
a mere
sneeze at.
10,000 German casualties seemed like it might signal the possibility of the initiative falling back into German hands. But 85,000 on a front of nearly 2 million men wasn't enough to change the flow of the war. The Soviets didn't lose their nerve or pull back after these losses. They were on a grim march forward to Berlin. Something else, something much more drastic would have to be done to put Germany back on the offensive. But as the battle lines evened out after the rapid German assault, everyone noticed one thing. There was a 100-mile long and 160-mile deep salient, or bulge, in the Russian lines around the town of Kursk. Cutting off this salient would strengthen the German position, deal a real blow to the Soviet army in the south, and if it could be done swiftly and decisively, return the initiative to the German forces. An attack on the Kursk salient was inevitable. It was just a matter of when. So join us next time for Operation Citadel, when the battle for Kursk begins.
Okay. So that was clearly a lot of like necessary foundation, because this is going to be a very clearly tank heavy conflict. And without understanding like the significance of the different kind of tanks, I'm not gonna have any idea what they're talking about. I'm already in kind of a deficit when it comes to the military stuff, so it's good that they're giving me something to work with here. I think this one's a 4-parter as well. So yeah, there's I think one more after this.
Days, weeks passed. The men on the front line waited for the inevitable, for the unthinkable, for the cataclysmic conflict that had to come around the salient at Kursk. Then it happened. One night, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht were given a special ration of schnapps, a sign every man knew.
Nice.
Liquor to steal the soul, a last drink before you die. One man deserts.
Not
He heads
nice.
to the Soviet line, and he's interrogated for hours. At last, he convinces a political officer on the scene, a man named Nikita Khrushchev, that he's telling the truth, that the
I know
attack will
him!
begin on July the 5th, the next day. Khrushchev calls Moscow in the middle of the night. Joseph Stalin is woken up. He asks Khrushchev for his assessment, to which Khrushchev replies, "We will make the enemy pay in blood." Then the Soviet guns begin to sing. All along the front, in the pre-dawn hours of July 5th, 1943, Soviet artillery attempts to disrupt German units forming up for the upcoming assault.
Now we're using
The
that
effect is
flag.
limited. The
Okay, it's so interesting seeing the depictions of the flags during this. It's all kind of a mess. I wish we could kind of just show things as they're supposed to be shown on, or is that like a different kind of flag? I'd assume there would be a swastika on it.
attempts to disrupt German units forming up for the upcoming assault. The effect is limited. The Wehrmacht have been planning for this day for too long. But Stalin and his greatest general Zhukov had not been idle either. They had turned the Kursk salient into a fortress. Observations along the frontier and intelligence supplied by the British made it all too clear that this is exactly where a German attack would come. At first, Stalin wanted to preempt the attack by an offensive of his own, but Zhukov eventually convinced him instead to build the greatest defensive works of the Eastern Front and let the Germans wade through their own dead to try to make it through. Once they'd been bloodied here, there'd be time enough for an offensive. And as the cannons roared and dawn broke, the great test finally came. The Luftwaffe took to the air, not for once as a force meant to cripple the enemy's air capacity, but rather simply as support for the massive assault. Bombs fell on artillery and bunkers rather than airfields. The Germans knew the air war couldn't be sustained. Still, the Soviet Air Force managed at first a haphazard response, and in the opening waves, large numbers of Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters fell from the sky. On the northeast, the German advance rolled forward, slowed by the vast minefields of the salient. New technology was tried. They deployed an innovation, a remote-controlled minesweeping vehicle. It was instantly met with fire from the Soviet artillery. Bursting shells and mines exploding under fire turned the battlefield into a haze of smoke and suspended earth. But the path was clear, at least at first, and the forces on the left pushed on. The far left, armed with the rare Ferdinand, an 88 mounted on a rejected version of the Tiger chassis, found itself struggling as the fighting devolved into fierce close-quarters combat. Their Ferdinand, their armed support, didn't have any close-quarters weapons. It was devoid of even the machine gun that was standard on most tanks. Losses began
really?
to mount, and yet still, they pushed on. In the center of the northern push, the new Tiger tanks started to show their mettle against the Soviet T-34, the tank that had been causing German armor so much trouble for years, and they began to push through. Gains were made, but everywhere they were stopped short of a true breakthrough. Luftwaffe and Red Air Force fighters traded turns strafing the ground, and the massive concentration of artillery from both sides continued non-stop. By late afternoon, it was clear that this was going to be no rush across France. All along the north, the Germans were slowly carving their way into the enemy lines, but behind every minefield they crossed, and every pillbox they shattered, there was just another minefield, another pillbox awaiting them in Zhukov's fortress Kursk. And casualties were beginning to mount. Even though much of the remaining German resources had been devoted for months to the offensive around Kursk, German reserves were at an all-time low. Partisan activity behind the lines further hampered men and material from reaching the front, and the variety of vehicles and the introduction of new and radical tank designs strained repair crews to their limits. Meanwhile, in the south, Manstein's force
Does not
began to
seem
execute a similar
super
plan, brutal in its
sustainable.
simplicity. Push forward. He had concentrated his forces in the center of his front, and planned to simply exert force at a point until the Soviets broke. He had some of the strongest panzer divisions left to the German army, and they would act like a spearhead to thrust through the Soviet line. His initial target was the small town of Obayan, a mere 30 miles from the front. But this attack began in stinging rain, which softened the ground and slowed operations. Even the following day, when the weather
Oh
cleared,
yeah, it
the
must be
bloody
hard to move a
terrain
tank through
hampered the
that.
advance. But with the clear weather came the war in the air. The Red Air Force thought that here they might surprise the Germans and catch their planes still on the ground, but the Luftwaffe scrambled just in time, and what initially appeared to be a turkey shoot for the Soviets turned into a massive battle in the sky. Over 400 planes whirled and chased along the 20 miles of the front. Underneath, hundreds of Panthers and Panzer IIIs and IVs and self-propelled...
By the end of the war, more than 8,000 Panther IVs had been built.
Guns rolled along a 2-mile stretch of open front. But even that wasn't enough.
Sorry.
Guns rolled along a 2...
Making it by far Germany's most important tank in terms of sheer numbers. All right.
Stretch of open front.
It was producible.
That wasn't enough. Slowed by weather and entangled in the Soviet defenses, the presence of so many tanks just didn't scatter the Soviet units like they would have 2 years before. Instead, they were met with the near-suicidal resistance of the Soviet Guard. Men would leap on tanks to take out their turrets with satchel charges, or face down panzers moving at full speed with anti-tank rifles. But the Germans did still have the practiced killers of the...
Satchel charges are like... Those are like the detonator things, right? They have like a remote detonator. I'm not great with any of this stuff, but I believe that's what we're talking about.
The SS Panzer Corps to throw at the south. The powerful Tigers destroyed bunkers from half a mile away, only to be met with the withering hail of Katyusha rockets. Flamethrower teams burnt their way forward, cooking men alive at their guns. It was a scene from hell. Rapidly, the Germans smashed through the front line, but this was resistance on a scale totally unlike what they'd expected. By the early morning hours of the next day, the Germans had barely reached the second line of Soviet defenses. Of the 3 major groups in the south, only one made it to its nominal first-day objective, and one was woefully behind. Soviet artillery took out bridge after bridge on the Donets, further hampering the advance. On both fronts, north and south, the Germans were making gains. Nowhere had they simply been repulsed or forced to reverse or retreat, and yet nowhere had they made a breakthrough either. Almost every contingent of the German forces was behind schedule, off the timetable of the initial planning. And yet the cost had been immense, for both sides. As the first few days of Operation Citadel wound down, the fate of the contest stood on a knife's edge. Neither side was winning, but neither side could be said to have started to lose. And on that knife's edge hung the fate of nations, if not the world. Hitler knew full well that a victory here wouldn't win him the war, but if he could win here and inflict major losses on the Soviet forces, it was possible that he might be able to sit down with the Soviet ambassadors and bargain for peace from a position of strength. A successful conclusion
Peace with
might
honor,
at least temporarily allow a cessation of the war in the East, so that German forces could be concentrated on the imminent war in the West. With Great Britain and the United States looking to finally truly push into Europe, a victory here might be able to cut them off from their ferocious Eastern ally. And in turn, a loss here would mean disaster. It would encourage the democracies in the West to hasten their invasion of Europe, if for no other reason than to prevent Stalin from capturing more European territory than they'd ever want him to have. It would mean the loss of some of the...
That's such an interesting balance. I do really love learning about, like, this period where we're sort of, like, teetering on, like, the ally-enemy line with the Soviets, how the U.S. kind of balanced that during this time. I find that immensely interesting, because it feels like even... like early on, we had understanding that they were our next enemy. I mean, we had... I learned about this like forever ago. I believe that we did something... I believe there was something that the U.S. did early on, like to disrupt... to attempt to disrupt the Russian Revolution. I think it was something like that. This would have been a long time ago. I would have learned this, and it would have been like a small thing, so I wouldn't know it in too much depth, but I believe we already had sort of like a conflict with them at the dawn of their new identity.
Best remaining units in the Reich, and destabilize a front that they could barely hold as it is. Join us next time as we watch which way the knife edge falls in this pivotal battle for the Eastern Front.
Alrighty, so we're getting there. So the next one, I believe, is the last one. Let me check this here. We got Hunting the Bismarck is next. I don't know if we're gonna do a break or if we'll go right into that. Hold on, just un momento. I'm just checking to see how much is on our plate left. So we're on video 8 out of 20. I don't know if we're going to be doing all of them. I don't think that's going to be happening at this rate. But I haven't ruled it out just yet. I think maybe D-Day will end up getting cut. I feel like we need D-Day though. Maybe I could do Defense of Poland or Battle of Saipan as like I don't know, as like a members only thing at a later point, so I can finally get all of it done. I don't know, that's a lot. We'll see where it takes us. Let me just switch this back. So. All right, let's go.
The race for the East was on. In both the North and the South, German divisions were reporting heavier than expected resistance by the Red Army, and in the sky, the Soviet Air Force was giving the Luftwaffe a run for its money. Mud and mines slowed the advance. Operations were behind schedule at almost every point. But at the same time, Soviet High Command was receiving reports of breaches in the first line of defense all along the front. Messages were coming in.
It was mainly the British and French that tried to intervene in the Russian Civil War. Trying to think of what I'm thinking of. Let me think. Hold on, I'm looking up something real quick. Soviet, American. There's a particular thing that I have in mind, but I can't. No, I'm not finding it upon an immediate Google search. So maybe I don't know what I'm saying. Maybe I don't know what I'm trying to remember. Maybe this was after. It's hard for me to tell. I'm a little bit lost in this. This would have been something I learned in passing a while back, so I don't know what it was. The US had some role too, but haven't looked into how substantial it was. I believe that's what it was. And even if it wasn't substantial, it would create like a lasting tension, I would imagine. I mean, the Americans wouldn't forget that if the Soviets did that to us.
And about the ferocity of the Tiger Corps. For the first time since the war in the East began, the T-34 was outclassed. Soviet tank crews now had to contend with crack German tankers with equipment that bested their own. In the north, the Germans had made it to the outskirts of the crossroad town of Punnery in the second defensive ring. As the second day began, though, the Soviets prepared a counterattack. Red Army troops would sweep back the invaders. Unfortunately, the reality on the ground was different. Messages got mixed, lost somewhere along the way, and only a small portion of the troops that were supposed to attack engaged. The attack was smashed, leaving nearly 70 Soviet tanks smoldering in its wake. Now it was the Germans' turn to renew the offensive, but now too it was the Germans' turn to be turned away at high cost. Forces began to be siphoned off. The front began to shrink. But the real fight was at Punnery. With no decisive breakthrough, it turned into the same type of house-to-house fighting that the Germans had faced at Stalingrad. The town swung back and forth, as attack and counterattack swept away the gains of previous day, or at times even previous hours from whatever side had made them. And the front narrowed further. By the 9th, operations were down to a roughly 1-mile stretch of the front. The German command staff met. There was a disagreement, not about whether the assault had stalled or whether the operation had failed. In that, they were all in morbid agreement. Rather, the remaining question was whether they withdraw or continue to try to apply pressure on the north, simply to divert resources away from the defense of the south. Germany's last hope for a resolution to the war in the east.
Not actually a religious
But
person.
at last, the resolution was to stay.
That is one of the things that people argue about when it comes to Hitler, like his how religious he actually was. From what I've heard, like, it's not that he didn't believe, I don't believe he didn't, it wasn't that he like didn't believe in any form of God, but like generally he lived his life in pretty secular fashion. That doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't believe in God. I'll leave that to somebody else who knows better to debate, but from what I've heard, that he lived secularly but that doesn't necessarily rule out like any sort of belief in like divinity. It's not like Hitler would have been an atheist. Just because you live secularly doesn't necessarily mean you're an atheist. Those things don't always equate. They can, but not always.
Because in the south, things fared better for the fascist army. The breach was larger. The Soviets were holding at the second line of defense, but the German tanks were pressuring them hard. There were no counterattacks here, just a...
I heard he was an atheist. I've heard that as well. It doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem like I'm an atheist. I don't believe Hitler and I would be like on the same page as far as like a belief in God. Perhaps not like a specific denomination. But I from what I was aware, like he had some underlying belief in God, but I'm sure there's plenty of conflict about that as well. I'm sure there are plenty of people who make the argument that he's an atheist, and maybe there's some validity to that. I don't know. He was nominally a Christian, but non-practicing. Yeah, it's like I have family members who they don't go to church every week. They don't do this or that, but they feel that there is like this something out there, and it's something spiritual. It's not specific, which take that for whatever it is. You could maybe, if you want to cast doubt on the degree of somebody's faith when they practice so casually, I'd say take that on a case-by-case basis. But I think there are plenty of people who just live their lives as they would if there were no God, but still believe in a God. You know, like they live life by earthly rules, but still believe that there's something else.
desperate attempt to hold on. Vatutin, the local Soviet commander, decided to dig in his T-34s. Literally dig in. He didn't just have his men throw up defensive structures in front of them. He had them buried up to the turrets. So, in the middle of this sweltering and humid July, his men were out burying their tanks, turning these mobile beasts into small hills, or rather small hill fortresses. Because the truth was that in the south, there was a stronger Tiger presence. The T-34s were getting hammered in the field. But by burying them, they essentially became highly defensible anti-tank guns. The small profile of the turret meant that the Tigers would have to get close enough that their superior range was no longer an advantage, and the T-34's turret was so stoutly constructed.
Sorry, I like reading these little notes at the bottom. T-34 was the second most produced tank of all time, 84,000 produced.
That even a direct hit, as difficult as that would be on a target,
it was beaten out by its own successor, the T-54-55 series, 100,000 plus estimated.
Target that small might not disable it. These dug in, as difficult as that would be on a target that small, might not disable it. These dug-in tanks provided far more of a hindrance than their mobile counterparts had. They had to be cleared one by one. They couldn't be driven off or easily neutralized from afar. And when coupled with the occasional unentrenched tanks which launched surprise attacks, they proved especially disruptive. Still, the panzers advanced, slowly carving their way forward through the second line. And as more reserves were called up, the third line began to look paper-thin. If the Germans weren't halted here, they could potentially drive forward and achieve what would be so disastrous for the Soviet cause: the encirclement of the Kursk salient. A breakthrough here would be a true breakthrough. More reserves were released. 2 tank corps were pulled forward. The 5th Guards Tank Army and the 5th Guards Army were moved towards the front. But Stalin was willing to play a dangerous game. They had another strategy in the works. If the forces at Kursk could simply pin down the Germans for long enough, other Soviet forces could sweep around them in a crushing counterattack. But this meant reserving troops for this counterattack force, which in turn meant that not every able-bodied tank and rifle could be committed to the defense. The southern front would have to hold with what it now had. But then, the mist and the rain swept in, bogging down the Germans, again causing delays. Still, they pushed on. Slowly, they clawed their way forward, under constant artillery fire, through minefields and past entrenched tanks. But just as it looked as though the front might crack, the Soviets swept in with a massive tank counterattack. It was beaten back, but again, it slowed the advance. Even still, the southern German front was continuing to press forward, especially the SS divisions, which fought with the ferocity and madness that had come to characterize these war criminals and butchers. One SS rifle division was pinned down by a railway. Their company commander was wounded, and a second lieutenant named Joachim Kruger took over. He fought like a savage. Twice wounded, he continued to fight. A T-34 flanked his company, and he charged it by himself. Then, in the hail of fire, a bullet ignited a smoke grenade that he'd been holding in his pants pocket. He ripped off his pants and undergarments and continued to lead the fight. Against such madness, what could the Soviets do? The order came down from on high that the front must hold, and so they would. It would be a fight to the last, because after this line there was nothing. Just open ground and the possibility of a lot of trapped men. As each day passed, attrition favored the Soviets, but held ground.
Of course, they're home.
The Germans had a chance to repair any damaged vehicles that now stood in the rear. Still, even with these repairs, the German tank corps were but a fraction of the strength that they had initially started this offensive with, and their infantry reserves had run out. The decisive showdown had to come, and on July 12th, it did, on the fields of Prokhorovka. The Germans were on the verge of the breakthrough they needed to seal Operation Citadel. Something had to be done. The Soviets' 5th Guards...
I just caught a little animation weird moment here. Because, like, right next to breakthrough, there's the S right here. And then when you go into the next shot, the S is right... You see, I'll put my mouse over it. Here's... Like, it's a small thing, but it's kind of funny. They likely had, like, a typo in the final thing, and they had to add in that S, like... after the fact in like a new cut, so they just didn't time it correctly there. I just think that's fun seeing the little things. Like, in production wise, they're fantastic. I'm not really poking fun at them. I just like noticing things.
To seal Operation Citadel, something had to be done. The Soviets' 5th Guards tank army, which had been brought up, was finally deployed to surprise and cut off the German advance. On the morning of the 12th, with artillery raining down, 1,000 tanks met in the field. At first caught off guard, the Germans met, then fought off the Soviet charge. Hundreds of Soviet tanks were left smoldering ruins, while fewer than 50 German tanks were damaged beyond repair. But the breakthrough that the Germans so desperately needed did not happen. The advance had been halted for the day, again. And then, word started to come down. The Allies had invaded Sicily. Hitler ordered the operation called off. The troops recalled to fight a European invasion. His officers protested. They were so close. But he would not hear of it. The order was given. Manstein planned to give it one last push, but
you gotta protect Italy.
Underway, Stalin's long-planned counterattack was beginning to roll out. The Soviets would hit the Nazi German forces with a force size
and like them not finishing the job in Russia is going to lead to the Russians being more powerful next time they have to face them.
Ferocity they were not expecting. It was a total rout. The Eastern Front collapsed. After this, the Germans would never again go on the offensive in the East. They would never again have a major victory against Soviet forces. They would fall back, and back, and back, until nearly 2 years later, Soviet troops entered Berlin.
Dude. And that was it? Damn, man. That's interesting. That was an interesting one. So that was very much the Soviet story, like the early Soviet story, and I find it interesting, but told from like kind of the more German-centric point of view. I feel like there was more on the Soviet side that we kind of missed out on than on the German side there. I don't know. Maybe it was attempting to be balanced. It felt like it leaned a little bit more towards like this is the attacker's story. But I don't know.